The 22nd edition of the World Economic Forum recently took place in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. Themed Shaping Africa's Transformation, the conference hosted delegates from over 70 countries to discuss the future of the region and to map out a blueprint for economic growth. Let's take a look.
At least 700 delegates from around Africa and the world gathered here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to discuss and debate some of the issues that are required to drive Africa's growth agenda forward. With the ongoing financial turmoil in traditional investment markets such as the US and Europe, investment and expansion into Africa was at the top of the forum's agenda.
These are economies that are very, very high growth. Growth rates far in excess of ours and the rest of the developed world. It's our backyard, Africa. I think our banks are able to come in and set up some pretty inexpensive acquisitions. From an investment banking perspective, we cover the continent. We have the hub model. Where do we put our own money is the question. And we put our own money almost exclusively into African land.
Well, I think for us as a development institution working with the private sector, it's important that we are here so we can help companies that want to come in or the local companies to expand and go regional, because I think you need to integrate Africa more, and this is a great opportunity for investments now in Africa. Africa is rising, and right now what we see is that Africa is growing, 5%. That's many, and out of the top 7 growing countries in the world, or top 10, 7 are actually in Africa.
With African economies expanding, it's natural there was a focus on building and integrating Africa's fragmented capital markets.
People need to understand what integration means. Integration means having common standards, having common laws, sharing systems, and making sure that each of the individual markets are strong. Some of the reasons why people are talking about integration is that some of our markets are small. Yes. And when markets are small, they're not as liquid as they should be. It will make the cost of transactions cheaper if we're sharing systems. If we have common standards, it will make sure that investors who invest in Southern Africa will already be familiar with the standards they will invest in East Africa or in West Africa.
Given the crucial role that infrastructure and investment play in facilitating Africa's transformation, both socially and economically, delegates across the board acknowledged that although there has been substantial progress, even more remained to be done.
Well, there have been a lot of discussions about the funding for infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion about why we need infrastructure, because we can't build infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure. And what has come out is that Africa needs to industrialize so that we can trade amongst ourselves, we can exchange commodities and trap capital on the African continent.
With a large portion of African farmers regarded as subsistence farmers, and with the continent sitting with 60% of the world's arable land, transformation of the agriculture industry on the continent remains a priority.
There was very serious disinvestment in agriculture the last 30 years. And then we had the food crisis in 2008 and 2009. And subsequently, both governments of African countries and the international development community realized that this was a red signal. And since then, there has been some efforts to try to galvanize additional resources, both from governments and from development partners, but more recently, getting the private sector to be involved. The recognition that Africa, even though it has challenges with respect to food security, when you take those challenges and turn them around, you have tremendous opportunities.
Joining me now in the studio to give us their views on this year's conference and what it means for investment in Africa is Josphat Mwaura, CEO and Senior Partner, KPMG East Africa, Lynette Chen, CEO, NEPAD Business Foundation, and Yunus Suleman, Chairman, KPMG Africa. Thank you all so much for your time. Well, it was certainly a week of robust debate and many opportunities coming to the fore. Yunus, let's kick off with you. In terms of the highlight when it comes to opportunities, what would you say that was?
I think the highlight was riding in this blue taxi.
I must admit the blue taxis did stand out. We were battling to get up the hills most of the time.
But I think it was an excellent experience. If you look at Invest Africa, I mean, the countries that are now more sought after from a developing and emerging market point of view is the high growth countries in Africa. And it's mainly because of the actual economic crisis in the Western world. So I think in terms of exciting opportunities, that what we saw come out of this World Economic Forum for Africa is that there's huge opportunity for really great returns in Africa, especially in the context of the middle market emergence, as well as everyone's seeking our natural resources. And ultimately, as was mentioned earlier, the investment in infrastructure. And that, I think, is attracting more and more sort of interest in this high growth continent of ours.
Lynette, we need to marry those high returns, obviously, with high risk. Do you think that that is still a prevalent concern, that doing business on the continent is very, very risky? Or are we changing that perception?
I certainly think that with the implementation of NEPAD as the Social and Economic Development Framework for Africa over the last 11 years, and through mechanisms like the African Peer Review Mechanism, which promotes transparency and accountability amongst governments, that there has been a lessening of risk, and the investment appetite into Africa has definitely increased. We also see that through NEPAD there is a lot more cooperation and willingness from a political level to collaborate between country governments for regional integration, particularly around infrastructure, around agriculture, around industrialization, and certainly that has lessened the risk of investment in Africa.
One of the themes to emanate from WEF was obviously the fact that it is time now to invest in Africa. Many people saying that we are about 20 years behind China. If you don't invest now, you're going to be seriously sorry 10, 15 years out. Is that the reality?
That's the reality, and Africa is an understated investment opportunity. And there are various reasons for that. First of all, the crisis in Western Europe and North America meant that there were very limited growth opportunities there. But they were all looking to the east for growth. But when they went to China and India, which were the markets that were looking for growth opportunities, they found nobody home. And they asked, where are the Chinese, where are the Indians? They're in Africa. And they followed them into Africa. And so now you've got this huge scramble for Africa. And you could see that even from the profile of the participants at the WEF. In fact, I thought from that profile, you had more non-African participants who are interested in coming into the continent or who are already doing business in the continent, attending the forum, understanding better the opportunities. And one thing that you actually get every time you go to a forum like that or you go to an African country is surprise. Many people are surprised by Ethiopia, by the facilities, by the quality of the conference, by the amount of development that was going on, by the number of global organizations that are there, because Ethiopia has got this sort of negative perception that it's a closed economy. But the Prime Minister was able to explain which bits they are not able to open up now and where they are at with everybody else, including manufacturing. So it is time to be in the continent. And what I'm finding is that many people who are not going to be here now will be paying a premium to invest if they wait another 10 to 15 years.
Was there enough emphasis placed on the turmoil in the developed world and what impact that is going to have on Africa going forward? We know it's certainly not over in terms of the turmoil. Did you have discussions along those lines with many of your peers?
I think there was a bit of discussion, but not enough focus on the rest of the world. I think the key thing was that the focus was on Africa. And the theme was the transformation, the shaping of the actual continent's economic environment. So I think that the right thing was done because this conference was focusing on Africa. The need was to focus and showcase Africa in terms of what opportunities there are, like Josphat said, in terms of the actual participants, so that they can bring their companies to invest in the appropriate industries and the opportunities then that present themselves. So I think from that perspective, it was, I think everyone acknowledges that the rest of the world is not going to give them that investment. And the risks of going anywhere else other than Africa is really not in anyone's interest. And the fact that agriculture, as Lynette says, is also a very important facet to focus on in terms of food security as well, and to feed Africans first. But the fact of the matter is, Africa is receiving the second highest investment, foreign direct investment in the world in 2010.
Lynette, do you think that's a trend set to continue? Is FDI only going to continue to flow faster and heavier into South Africa, into Africa?
Definitely. As mentioned, Africa's mineral resources are sort of the most sought after commodity. The second biggest natural resource that's being sought after is land and agriculture because of the food security issues. And you're finding countries from abroad are now buying up huge tracts of land where they're farming and exporting raw materials. And again, what I've cautioned at WEF is that we need to ensure that we do not follow necessarily the same steps as experienced in the mineral sector, where we are actually processing, beneficiating and exporting finished goods. And that there is, first of all, sufficient food to feed Africans and then feed the rest of the world, because we have that capability. So I definitely think the FDI will continue to flow in Africa, because we have such huge areas of need. There is, opportunity everywhere. We are needing basic infrastructure, water, sanitation, housing, healthcare services. So, we need to grow a lot. And as mentioned earlier, Ethiopia was, I think, very exciting, because I think globally there was this perception of 25 years ago, Ethiopia is a starving country, the famine-ridden, starving children. And when you arrive there, there's construction happening on every street corner. These skyscrapers going up, world-class facilities, the African Union building.
Did you find that family and friends before you went up were slightly concerned that you were going into darkest Africa and you had to set the story right when you got back home?
Well, actually, it's been about my 4th or 5th trip. So, at my first trip there, I was very impressed, and I still continue to be impressed each visit, because there's so much development going on.
Josphat, just in terms of the East Africa community, you're seeing great things happening on the ground there. We're going to chat about the integration emanating from that territory directly after this short commercial break, so just hold that thought.